This video, I'd like to run through some quick core work for handball players. It's also good for that matter for any rotational type athlete, golf, baseball, softball, because we tend to get in rotational sports kind of anterior pelvic tilted. So I like isometric core work for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that it works on controlling the pelvis. So we're not letting it sway one way or another. If we're just doing crunches and sit-ups, the pelvis is already just flat on the ground. It doesn't really require any control. And if we're doing, the hang and the pulls and stuff like that, well, similar to crunches and sit-ups, oftentimes we're kind of jacking our lower back around. It doesn't always have to be the case, but I still think isometric stuff where we're keeping our spine long and good posture, I still think that is superior when it comes to core work. So one of the bigger reasons for that, it comes down to posture. And posture is not just about, looking good or standing up straight, but it dictates function. So one example, because I run into this being kind of tall, is, getting here quite often. And so all that posture is telling us is that we're relatively too strong in the front than we are back here. So it doesn't mean we want to weaken in the front, it means we want to strengthen in the back. So doing, pulls or rows can help straighten that out, and reinforcing that if I'm doing, say, core work. So like a front plank, avoiding the rounding the shoulders, right? So often that's because my chin's going down and I'm rounding here. I want to think of making my spine as long as possible for that type of core work. But I believe I mentioned this in an article before, but if you do this, for example, this is one of the most common ones, so I like using this. If you round here, for example, makes it really difficult to get your elbow above your shoulder and especially to rotate. So it requires some pretty good mobility up in our shoulders, especially T-spine mobility, to get our elbow back and our shoulder, rotating at the T-spine. So back to how that ties into core work. Crunches, sit-ups, stuff like that. Not that it's bad. I guess it could be if we're really jacking our spine around a lot. But again, I think there's much superior core work when it comes to helping posture, which helps function, and also helps keep our spine and our pelvis in good alignment. So with that said, I'll run through a couple of variations that you can do besides just the basic front plank and side plank. But first, before that, couple common mistakes that we often see on side planks or front planks, just the basic ones, besides what I told you here, rounding. Now on side plank, which I really like for handball, baseball, softball, golf, rotational athletes, because we're strengthening the obliques, which are attached to the hip, is what we'll see is often rotating here and or butt back. So I'll show you a quick demo of those. So notice how not only was my butt back, but I was rounding here. And if I straighten it out, it makes it a lot more difficult and pop my hips through, but it makes it much better exercise. So now once those get too easy or you kind of master them, which I would say is over a minute and a half for sure for front planks and around a minute even for side planks. Once you get to that point, it's time to challenge them a little bit. And there's multiple ways to do that. So it's important to not get bored or get stale with those planking exercises. So different ways to challenge that besides bands and stuff where maybe it's pulling, are simply raising the feet up on some kind of platform or box, and also putting weight on your back. Besides the feet elevated or weight resisted planks, we can also do glute activation type stuff with the planks, which I really like because they're in a cross section from the obliques, so it's helping tilt the pelvis more posteriorly. And again, in handball and rotational sports, we tend to get kind of an anterior pelvic tilt. It's an adaptation of the sport, so it's not a bad thing per se, but if it gets too out of control, we can run into injuries. So that can help kind of control it. And when we do that, we're activating the glute. So we're not just moving the leg, we're not just doing this but we're actually using the glute to push during the movement. So here's, for example, a front plank with glute activation. And a side plank with glute activation. Now, of course, the glute activation can also be combined with feet elevated on a box or a bench, and or weight on the back as well. The progressions are kind of endless. If it gets too easy, you can keep pushing the time further. But once the time gets too long and it gets too easy in that regard, then you can challenge it in other ways. And the stronger our core is isometrically, the more force that can transfer through the body. So that's the final reason that I really like isometric core exercises, because you hear this term a lot, but it's functional core. It's more functional, meaning the role of the core isn't to generate power in crunching movement, right? Like the core doesn't do this to then produce force. The hips produce force. It starts at our foot. When our foot hits the ground, the force comes up the chain, and to rotate, then our hips rotate, and the core has to be strong enough to then snap everything together, right? So it comes up into our arm, and that finishes the rotational movement, whatever it may be: handball, golf, baseball, softball, any type of rotation. So if you think of the core as a combination of strong rubber bands, then keeping them long and strong is important for transferring that force. So that's why good isometric, keeping our spine long and kind of stretching out the core, in my opinion, and actually a lot of different strength and conditioning experts and trainers, in their opinions as well, is a lot superior than just kind of crunching it and shortening those muscles.